All right. So good morning, everyone. It's Friday, April 9th. It's 9:02 a.m. This is a meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy. And we are meeting with Secretary Moore and Ms. Byrne this morning to talk about funding. The governor just brought out a proposal related to using ARPA funds to supplement the current proposals. And we know that in the offing, there may be an American Jobs Plan bill, an infrastructure bill, as I understand it, due out something like October. So the good news is that there is more money to do more of the work that most of us would like to have been doing. The challenge is that there are at least three streams of money moving, and it's kind of a dynamic situation. So we thought it'd be great to touch base with the secretary, better understand the governor's proposal, and then think about ways for us to manage this dynamic landscape over the coming year and 2 years, 3 years. Okay, so that's my preamble for why we're happy to have the secretary in to talk with us this morning, and Ms. Byrne as well. So thanks again, Madam Secretary. Floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Senator Bray. Drew, do I have the ability to share my screen? It looks like I do.
Yeah. And sorry,
it says it's disabled.
Right. And while that you're setting up, one note for committee and anyone watching, Senator Campion is testifying in Senate Education, and then so we won't see him till later. Okay, thank you.
Great.
He's testifying in front of his own committee?
Oh, sorry, House Education. House Education.
Excuse me. Okay, there you go.
Thank you.
So I thought I could just walk through a high-level overview of what is contained in the governor's packages around climate change and water infrastructure. And also just want to flag for you all that there is a fairly significant investment also anticipated in outdoor recreation as part of the economic recovery package. And happy to entertain questions as we move along. But if at the highest level, the governor's rolled out about $1 billion of proposed investments, 370 million of which are either in climate or water and sewer infrastructure. And then, as I indicated, there's 25 million proposed within the economic development bucket. There's also some amount of cross fertilization or pollination with the housing package, in that we are actively working with the Department of Housing and Community Development to look for opportunities to both improve the quality of the drinking water going into many of our housing projects, as well as install more efficient appliances, potentially do some fuel switching, retrofitting units that are being rehabilitated with all electric heat sources, and weatherization. Just stepping into the climate change investments, overarching, the goal here is to make investments in technology and infrastructure and hazard reduction. And those are sort of the big three categories, as well as, the necessary tie back to the negative economic impacts associated with COVID-19. But the ability then to leverage these dollars to both respond to those impacts, as well as take on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving air quality, particularly indoor air quality and public health, and enhancing our resilience. So the investments fall into, or proposed investments would fall into five broad categories. The first four of which I think could all be considered no regrets policies. And the reason to talk about them as no regrets policies is because there's an ongoing book of work by the Climate Council, and we're trying to be respectful of that process to develop a climate action plan, which you may recall is due December 1st of this year. It's an aggressive timeline. The dozens of people involved in that effort now are working many hours each week, and want to make sure that we're not taking steps that may not be in perfect sync with the recommendations ultimately contained in the climate action plan. So tried to focus some initial investments in these areas of no regrets, things we know we're going to need to do. The first of which is investing in electric vehicle infrastructure. This is looking at investments of level 2 and level 3 chargers at strategic locations at state facilities, as well as providing incentives to see this infrastructure start to be built out at businesses and multifamily housing units, as well as other areas of activity. The next bucket of investment is weatherization. This builds on the proposal the governor had made in his FY22 recommended budget, which included increased funding to the Office of Economic Opportunity. This will extend that accelerated weatherization work through the end of calendar year 2024, which is when the ARPA monies would need to be expended by, and allow sort of the ramp up to be sustained. We've heard from our community action partners that having a sustained and longer term commitment to funding is really important to their ability to staff up appropriately. And so we think showing that this is intended to last for several more years is a helpful signal to them, and fully anticipate that the Climate Council may recommend additional accelerated investments in this space. The next bucket of investments relates to electrification incentives. And this is looking at a high level at load management activity at the utility scale, as well as at a more local level, looking at the opportunities presented by storage and some beneficial electrification to take full advantage of renewable resources we may already have on the grid, but that at times are located in areas that are capacity constrained. And then the final bucket of these no regrets policies is to dedicate funding to support some of the highest priority action items identified in the state's 2018 hazard mitigation plan, specifically creating a state level hazard mitigation buyout program. We know that there are areas within Vermont that have been impacted by multiple flood events, but for various reasons don't qualify for the FEMA buyout program. And this would allow us to help move some of those residents out of harm's way. And this was one of the highest priority, I think I may have said that, action items contained within the state's 2018 hazard mitigation plan. The other piece is a proposal to hold $100 million to support initial implementation of the recommendations of the climate action plan. As I said, it may be that the initial recommendations line up very much with these no regrets policies that we're proposing to move forward with immediately, and we'll further expand that work. But that we wanted to make sure that there were resources available to be directed, given the incredible investment of time and expertise that's being made in the development of the action plan itself. And I guess, Senator Bray, I could pause there before shifting to water and answer questions if folks have them.
Sure. Let me see if any committee members have questions. I have a couple. Well, let me get the ball rolling. So can you just clarify for us the relationship of this proposed new or additional this new spending in relation to, for instance, in S109, we proposed, spending that actually responds in part to the governor's, it's really a modified version, right, of the governor's earlier proposal on weatherization. And so we're seeing $21 million of weatherization money here. Is that supplemental, entirely supplemental? Okay.
It is. It's in addition to what was in the governor's FY22 recommend.
Okay. And although, again, I'm not trying to be contrarian, I just suppose it's like this worrying side of me that says, I'm having some trouble understanding how my understanding based on reading documentation from NCSL, not from the Treasury, it describes ARPA, American Rescue Plan, the American Rescue Program Act dollars as sort of an extension of CARES efforts already underway, mitigating the impacts of COVID. So I'm just wondering, I'm trying to understand how I would, if someone said to me, well, how would electric vehicle infrastructure relate to COVID recovery? Although I'm delighted to see electric vehicle infrastructure on the list, I don't know how I would make that connection. So can you help the committee understand that better, please?
Sure, I will do my best. I may ask Emily to offer any insight she has as well. I know we're all anxiously awaiting the Treasury guidance, which should hopefully provide clarity. But the American Rescue Plan funding does go beyond CARES Act in that it speaks to economic recovery. And so a lot of these activities we look at as economic, part and parcel of economic recovery. And helping ensure we're in a position to rebound and recognize we're going to have to do a job making the case that each one of these plays that important role. But we believe that having a more resilient Vermont is really essential to a sustained economic recovery from COVID. Emily, is there anything you would add to that?
You are still muted.
There we go. That should work. Yeah, it's really in that we can use these funds to offset the negative economic opportunity. And to the extent we'll be putting shovels in the ground and sort of moving money through the economy, that we can sort of direct it towards climate change related things, but ultimately as sort of a broader economic stimulus, if you will.
Okay. And a quick question in terms of what do you have anything that you've received from the federal government or the delegation or Treasury that you're using as your initial guidance? And is that something you can share with the committee? Because as I referenced, the best document I could find was from NCSL, which is definitely not the federal government. So it might be helpful for all of us to be looking at the same documents as we think about these things. How are you, in what form are you receiving guidance?
Yeah, so we have been referring to two documents. One is produced by FFSL, is that correct, Brian?
FIS, the Federal
FFIS.
Fiscal Information for the States.
And so we'd be happy to share that. And I am at a loss as to what the second document Secretary Young had circulated, what around had been from. Maybe Council of State Governments.
Maybe, and I think all of the sort of associations that support state governments, either National Governors Association or the National Association of State Budget Officers or the accounting, have been releasing documents. So I think there's a lot of very similar to NCSL type documents that say the same thing kind of over and over again in different words, but we can share some of those if that's helpful.
Sure, if you could pick sort of your top one or two and just send them along, that would be helpful. So we look at the same descriptions of what we're all waiting to see unfold, which, as I understand it from our visiting with our delegation, they have 60 days to bring out, Treasury has 60 days to bring out full guidance, and that they may well take all 60 days, which pushes that date to May 11th. Which is an awkward date for the legislature personally, but anyway, it is what it is.
And that's very consistent with what we've been hearing as well, that Treasury is being thoughtful in developing their guidance, and it is likely to be the first week in May, if not a little bit later by the time it's released.
Okay, I see Senator McCormick has a question, and then Senator Westman.
Thanks. Apologies, you probably already addressed this. Where I'm working from home, I have a view out the window, and there was some wildlife that distracted me for a moment. Are these figures where the administration wants to spend the ARPA money or the COVID money? Or correct. I guess it's not ARPA, it's COVID money. Or is this the figure that we arrive at? Is this the sum total with the addition of the federal funds?
So this is specific. I can actually back up a slide that may be helpful, or two slides. Excuse me. This is the $200 million that was shown on that last slide is a portion of the approximately $1 billion that Vermont is receiving in ARPA funds that's sort of discretionary to the state.
Okay, so that's all, that's in addition to what we had been planning on spending of our own money?
Yes, correct. That is in addition to the one-time monies that were in the governor's 22 recommend, and the legislatures continue to work with.
And again, apologies if you actually did say that. There was
problem.
something out there that was just fascinating. Thanks.
Well, we're also not used to seeing an extra $1 billion that we need to explain. Senator Westman.
So you partially just answered that. So for example, the 21 million is in addition. Is that spread out over the 3 years, or because you mentioned 22? And
yes. Yes, it is. So the way we've put these budgets together, and my understanding is the governor's team at Finance and Management is working to turn all of this into legislative prose and expects to bring it to the legislature. I guess this is the end of this week, so probably early next week. But with both a proposed FY22 spend as well as recommendations for FY23 and FY24. But the dollar figures shown on the table in front of you reflect the total investment all 3 years.
right. So the 21 is what we spent this year, and that will carry into 23 because we don't have to spend this till the end of 24.
Correct.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking at the governor's handout of April 6th, proposed investment in American Recovery Plan's funds. And I see that there are allocations, not many, but all the way out through FY25. So.
Correct. Yeah, I think
Great.
largely the climate action plan money, and part of that is just not yet having a sense for what the recommendations are going to be within the climate action plan, but anticipating because they will be later into the process, they may need longer on the back end. And I think part of the direction to all of the executive agencies has been to look for ways to sort of front load this work and not develop a schedule that you have to be spot on to actually have invested all of these dollars by December 31st, 2024 to try and leave ourselves a little bit of buffer, knowing that things don't always go according to plans.
Sure. Well, and one of the very helpful things about looking at the spends for 22, 3, 4, 5 is continuity of effort. And we've been hamstrung a little in the past by our inability to commit substantial funds for an extended period of time. And then that makes it hard for all the actors that would do the work to staff up and take on all the front end expense if they're not sure money is going to be there when they're finally finished all their engineering and permitting and all the rest. Okay, great.
Exactly. And even the weatherization piece, very much Senator Bray is in that space where I know with ARA funds 10 or 12 years ago, there had been a big push to do a lot of weatherization, but it was short-lived. And so there were a lot of concerns as to how long-lived this particular set of investments would be, and if it made sense again to invest in the workforce development piece.
Yeah, I think the ARA story, particularly around weatherization, has chastened this committee ever since. It's like, let's not do that again.
Right.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
So I can move on then to the water infrastructure investments. And the governor is proposing $170 million in this space. Water and sewer infrastructure, as you probably know, are explicitly called out as an allowable use of ARPA funds. So we feel pretty confident that what we've proposed in this space is likely to be consistent with the guidance. So the certainly a lion's share of the money is being proposed for stormwater retrofit projects. This includes help supporting implementation of the 3-acre stormwater permit requirements that, as you know, came into effect at the end of last calendar year. But it also includes funding to help support municipal or accelerate implementation of flow restoration plans, which are the plans that have been developed for our stormwater impaired waters in Franklin, Chittenden, and Rutland counties, as well as ongoing support for the work needed to address stormwater runoff from municipal roads and state highways. So it's a very considerable investment, but certainly priority work, both in terms of water quality and in terms of resilience. The next bucket, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Matt, sorry, can you explain a little to the committee what flow restoration projects are, please? Thanks.
Yeah, so there are a dozen or more generally fairly small streams, things like Rug Brook in St. Albans or Potash Brook in South Burlington, that have been damaged by stormwater flows, meaning that their high flows are too high and oftentimes their low flows are too low. And so a lot of the work around flow restoration is trying to identify places for infiltration-based practices to return more of the stormwater to the groundwater, and then have that both reduce those high peaks and provide some additional base flow during the drier summer months. And so municipalities have taken the lead in developing those flow restoration plans, often in partnership with the Agency of Transportation. They have a fairly long timeline for implementation. I believe they're also 20 years. And the thought is there's some projects that are very well developed. And with this kind of funding, we could actually accelerate implementation of those flow restoration plans.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The next bucket of investment is in what we're calling village water, wastewater, and pretreatment. We know that community scale, this doesn't necessarily mean town-wide, but in these in these downtown centers or downtown areas, that community scale water and wastewater is really important to the ability to have infill and redevelopment. And there are examples sort of statewide. Right before the COVID shutdown, I had the opportunity to visit the Brownsville General Store near Mount Escutney, which is the example of exactly the kind of projects that these systems support, which is they took their general store and had turned it into a general store and market cafe under new young ownership. But because of that change in use, they needed additional wastewater capacity, and their current system simply couldn't provide it. There were a number of people who came together in that instance, and they developed a community scale system that supported not only the Brownsville General Store, but I believe also the adjacent fire department, and a couple of nearby residences. Those are the types of systems that this money is envisioned to support. This isn't building new treatment plants, but rather community scale systems to really promote the kind of compact development I think we all want. In addition, in this bucket would be resources for pretreatment. Pretreatment is necessary for businesses that tend to produce high strength waste. And we mean things like breweries, distilleries, meat processing, and dairy processing facilities, where when those facilities are located within the service area of a small existing wastewater treatment facility, they can upset the facility by sending really rich waste to it, sort of in batches as they produce it. Pretreatment is a very necessary component of allowing those businesses to expand. And we know, frankly, the lack of pretreatment in several instances is keeping businesses from expanding. And so the hope is here we could offer some cost share that would allow those pretreatment systems to be brought online in short order. Next on the list is one that obviously we've spent considerable time talking about, which is CSO abatement. $30 million is proposed here to accelerate the implementation of long-term control plans. We're in the position now where I think all but one of our CSO communities have final long-term control plans. Every one of them has submitted a draft to the state. And so there is a bevy of projects that's been identified, and these dollars would be used to accelerate that implementation. The next $15 million in dam safety investments is towards the dam infrastructure that's actually owned by the Agency of Natural Resources. As you may know, we own 80 dams, 20 of which are in poor condition currently. And these monies would be used to invest in the repairs of a number of these facilities. These dams are often what's providing the recreational assets and frankly waterfront that camp owners and others enjoy. And so removal isn't always an option. And there's very rarely monies available to help improve these facilities. So we look forward to being able to make some of those investments. And then finally, what we're calling a Healthy Homes Initiative, which is focused on residential scale water systems and has sort of three primary components. One would be a concerted effort in mobile home parks to improve existing water and wastewater systems. We know that the financial straits that many of the residents of mobile home parks, particularly those that are cooperatively owned or held by nonprofits, find themselves in, make increasing utility bills challenging. So looking for ways to ensure that we are investing in those systems. Another piece is working, as I indicated, and I think in the outset of my remarks, with the Department of Housing and Community Development to try to ensure that as we are rehabilitating and renovating housing units in that as part of their housing package, that we're also looking at the opportunities to improve the drinking water infrastructure in particular within those same facilities. And then actually creating an on-site wastewater and drinking water well grant program for low-income Vermonters. Currently, we only are able to offer folks market rate loans when they need to replace their on-site wastewater disposal system or their well fails. And for the lower income Vermonters, a market rate loan isn't really a viable approach to helping them replace those systems. And so creating a grant opportunity that we can couple with that existing program to help folks that are economically challenged.
Okay. We've asked Commissioner Walk and Commissioner Snyder in next week, and one of the things that we want to we're requesting is some help in developing sort of a prioritized list. So I know that there's we'll need to figure this out. I don't want to interrupt the presentation, but I didn't want to pass by this without pausing to at least discuss the issue. And we've had some committee discussion. I'd invite Senator Westman to jump in because we're interested as a committee on being able to work with you all on having a prioritized list. People have said, and we would like to know that not only that we have a general commitment to the clean water, that we know what kind of projects we're aiming to take on. There's a large public interest in being more specific. And so we're asking some of your commissioners to come in and help us better understand the opportunities that you see. And we want to talk about some priorities that the committee frankly has. Particularly around CSOs. And so Senator Westman, do you have anything you want to add around?
I would just say, I think we're very happy that you've laid out these amount of dollars. Unless you give us an idea of what projects we're in total we feel like we need to get to, and what the cost is of those, we really have no idea of what the framework is of where this money fits. And is the problem if we end up in the fall with another $500 billion. What can we take? What can we bite off as with that money? How much of the overall problem that we need to get to clean the lake up and to clean the waters that we're under mandate to clean up? How far will we get with this? And that will, in broad strokes, say for me, and I only speak for me, it will help us think about what policy directives we might give to you as the administration and say, this needs to be first, that needs or is there enough money to do it all? And I doubt there's enough money to do it all.
Correct. Just a few thoughts in response to that's helpful input and framing. Thank you. One is that there isn't enough money to do it all. For example, we know on the stormwater retrofits project, we believe that there's probably upwards of $400 million worth of needs statewide under the umbrella of the 3-acre stormwater permit, the flow restoration plans, the municipal roads general permit, and the transportation separate storm sewer system permit. So obviously 75 million represents a fraction of that. One of the challenges is one, frankly, of just capacity and timing, that many of our water and sewer and stormwater initiatives are intentionally designed as 20-year programs. I know that that's frustrating to folks who want to see dramatic improvements in water quality immediately. But the fact of the matter is these are complicated engineering problems and disruptive and take time. And so some of what's reflected in this package that I've just walked through is the urgency and the need, and some of it is the capacity that's reflected there. And so we've tried to scale these various initiatives, starting very much from the point you and Senator Bray indicated of what's the total universe of need to what do we think we can really put on the ground between now and the end of calendar year 2024. I would encourage the committee to think about criteria as opposed to identifying specific projects. It can be very challenging to us to have a punch list of projects where something may come up and that project is no longer ready to move forward. And if we've said we're going to fix, this issue in this town, to the extent that issue in that town isn't ready to roll, it means we're unable to sort of go to the next piece down the list. So just encourage you to think in terms of criteria that would help define your priority projects. And then have us apply those criteria in reviewing projects that come forward. And then the last piece is just you're correct in thinking ahead to the potential infrastructure package. I'm sure one of the things you will hear over the next few weeks is the need for investment in existing water and sewer infrastructure. And outside of CSO abatement, that really isn't on this list. And that we are anticipating, I know Commissioner Walk participated in a White House intergovernmental briefing last night, that infrastructure package would contain significant resources to help with the refurbishment and modernization of existing water and sewer infrastructure.
I would just say it would help us to have that overall big picture of where are the pockets that we need to. I don't think anyone suggested that we wanted to manage individual projects. I think, but to know that you had that list to come up with a number is important for us to
Sure.
be able to do that in the overall. But the overall picture of what this and what we think we can bite off with this money is important. Also, I would say timing is important because you are going to come to the legislature and ask, you're asking for authorization to spend this. So timing is important in that piece. And we all want to use those dollars wisely. So for example, with CSO abatement, if that money ends up in the budget, it ends up in the budget July 1st. There's no way those projects are going to be completed by October. And if I find that in October, an infrastructure package is it fit in underneath that infrastructure package, we might very well decide that that money needs to be swapped out from this list. So, you know, timing and how this gets appropriated to use the appropriate pot of money as effectively as we can is important. The other piece, I think in the 35, that's where I saw design money for communities. That design money, we might want to get out the door as soon as the budget passes, because from my point of view, we're going to want to have as many projects as we can ready by October, when that federal money, not knowing what the stipulations are. So that pre and design stuff is all stuff that you're going to manage, but we're going to want to know that you've got the plan and you are going to come to us to ask us for the money.
Yes, very much.
I think it's thanks, Senator Westman. That's very helpful. And I think that's a much more detailed explanation of what I was alluding to at the beginning, that there's this waterfall effect where as funds become available, they may displace other funds, and then that creates new opportunities. And we're going to live with a year's worth of dynamic funding through. I don't think the dust may not have settled completely even a year from today, but hopefully we know a lot more.
No, I think to the extent this, you know, in some ways the budget is the most important policy document an administration puts forward. I think here, again, we are trying to indicate the areas of priority, appreciating very much there may be opportunities to swap different pots of money. These are our priorities given what we know and have in front of us currently, and appreciate very much that if there is a federal infrastructure bill, that it may reorder the list or change what the funding source is, but I still believe these sort of sit at the top of where the dollars we have in front of us right now would be best invested in service of our environmental goals.
And Senator Westman, go ahead, please.
Oh, I don't want to jump in ahead, but therein lies the question that you know, one of the things we might say in a budget, in a appropriation, is we approve the go ahead of this, but if the federal money in October looks more appropriate, we want to swap out for that. And so therein lies the question: how do you work with us, and how would you propose to keep this committee specifically in the loop to understand what the choices are, and as the policy needs to change to accomplish what we all want to get to in the most effective way?
Yeah, I mean, I would ask Bern to weigh in here too, but I think it is going to be important to have open lines of communication to make sure we have a consistent and shared understanding of what these different pots of funding can be used for, and just a commitment to continue to have that kind of dynamic conversation, and make those substitutions as needed. In some ways, I'm hoping that's taking place. I don't know if behind the scenes is the right way, but doesn't necessarily alter the priorities we have here. I think this public facing articulation of the types of projects and programs that we believe should be first out of the gate is really important to our partners, to municipalities, and seeing the areas the state intends to emphasize with the dollars we have, and helping drive their own decision making and investments. So there's a lot of different audiences, but and would ask Emily if you have anything you'd want to add to that.
I think it will be one thing in my mind that will be challenging is right once the appropriations bill passes and we kind of get the green light to go and do stuff, right? We're going to start writing grant agreements and executing contracts and moving forward with things. When the new infrastructure bill comes in, and if it does overlap with things, it is like if things are already signed and gone, right? Dealing with those things will be different. I think the benefit is that not benefit maybe, but this is a lot of money, and it's going to take us it's not going to take us a long time, but it's going to be a whole lot of work over the summer to actually do those grant agreements and get that. So I think there will be some places, right, where things are moving and there's going to be some overlap and we're going to have to untangle things or figure out what we can do. But there is going to be this sort of constant guidance is going to change. More money is going to come in. I think it's going to be a complicated dance between us, the feds, the legislature to kind of figure all of that out. But keeping communication open, making sure that, you're asking us to report on what we've obligated and, like what the pipeline is looking like kind of in real time will be important.
We need to talk about that. I would just say for myself, you've said for the agency, CSO abatement in the 30 million is at the top of the list, and you've laid out what's at the top of your list. What I don't see behind it, which you need to create the big picture of, is what is the policy that drives it to make these the top of the list? And why should we buy into these being at the top of the list from a policy level?
I would expand on Senator Westman's remark in that, we've had some conversation. Usually when you have a prioritized list, it's the result of applying criteria to a whole set of choices. And the question now, like, what are the criteria that we're applying? I mean, if it was when we talked Lake Champlain TMDL, the metric was usually the lowest cost per unit of phosphorus avoided or reduced. But then we have TMDLs related to E. coli. So do we then have sort of a lowest cost per unit of E. coli avoided or reduced? Or do we have habitat quality criteria that we apply? So that might argue for flow restoration, and so I think we're trying to better understand what policies and what criteria are producing the lists that we're seeing. And then beyond that, because the criteria reflect policy choices in the end, kind of like a budget reflects values. And then beyond that, having a sense of the total universe of expense helps us see what of our total of the capacity we have, how much are we allocating to any particular criteria, and I think that's where it's a very healthy conversation to me. It's at a scale that we haven't stepped back and looked at for a while. So this is not a challenge to ANR. It's that we want to have the conversation. That's all.
We look forward to bringing that information forward.
Right. So Ms. Flanders, we have you scheduled to appear on S129. Is that what you asked to be here for?
Yes, it is. But I have a question if you can.
Well, I'm sorry.
Related to this investment.
Could we ask you to hold your question for now?
Okay.
And
it's going to be related to these various categories and not to the one that I'm scheduled to talk to?
Sure. Well, we'll be coming back to this. So I'm just mindful that we're going to be short of time with our scheduled witnesses. And so we're happy that you're joining us, but we scheduled you under 129. And then when we come back to this, we can schedule a visit again.
All right. If you could keep in mind that my question will be related to small business innovative research. When I was at the Pentagon or in acquisition in the DC area, it was called generally an SBIR. And I'd like to know if there were opportunities. You don't have to address it now, but I'd like to know if there were or if there are planned to be opportunities in the arena of SBIR that various communities or groups could take advantage of. That's all. And I'm going to put myself
Okay.
back on mute.
Okay, no problem. The Zoom world's a little different than our regular committee room. So so I wrote that question down, and if our committee assistant will keep you on the list for our next time we're taking this up. We're planning to have the agency back in next week at the commissioner level. So well, let's connect when we have that next meeting. So anyway, to wrap up on this, I think
I have a couple more slides if you want,
yes,
Senator
please.
Bray. I don't know if your comments were specific to water infrastructure or just wrapping this all up, but it would just like to flag the outdoor recreation piece for the committee as well.
Yes.
Okay. And so as part of the economic development allocation, there is $25 million dedicated to outdoor recreation. It's fairly broad in the strokes it speaks to right now, but it includes amenities along and adjacent to rail trails, including the build out of the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail, continued expanded VOREC grants. As you may recall, the H315 includes $5 million for a dramatic expansion to the VOREC grant program in FY22, and can hopefully continue to build on that anticipated success. And then strategic investments across public and private lands, largely in trails, but also other recreational assets, appreciating the important role the outdoor recreation economy plays to particularly many of our most rural communities. And the last piece I would flag is that also within that economic development allocation, there's $3 million to support expedited permitting, which would go towards additional limited service staff at ANR, the NRB, and fire safety to manage what we anticipate will be increased permitting loads associated with ARPA projects, probably most notably the housing projects, but also broadband and some of the water and sewer efforts as well, to ensure that our own capacity isn't a hindrance to the timely and expeditious use of these resources.
Okay, thank you. The recreation piece, I know that we have, I forget the date, it might have been April 1st, which is probably not an auspicious date to use for a report deadline. The trails group was going to be reporting out. Do you, I hadn't asked you this ahead of time. If you don't know, fine. I'm thinking aloud with you. If we're going to, one of the things that's been interfering a little bit with outdoor recreation work, particularly as it relates to trails, there's been the uncertainty around permitting. And so we had a pretty thorny discussion last year trying to sort that out. Then it got spun out to a working group that was going to come back with a proposal. And I think it was April 1st. Do you know the status of that? I know that Commissioner Snyder is scheduled to be in next week, so I can wait.
I do know the status. It was actually March 15th. And
Okay.
It was a report back from Commissioner Snyder to the governor. And we submitted our report. I believe he at least intended to share a copy with you. I don't want to say he did. About that time, and we made a set of recommendations. It reflects our recommendations. We have heard from the trails groups that they don't necessarily support what we put forward. They feel it is still more regulatory, I believe, in nature than the approach they had hoped to see. But we felt it went a long way towards addressing what had been identified to us as challenges associated with these long linear projects that cross multiple properties and sort of the broader construct of Act 250. It was established as an opt-in program, which we had hoped would also address concerns we had heard. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been a lot of discussion around the recommendations of that report in the legislature, or frankly outside the legislature, since we finalized it.
Okay, so I'll put that on our to-do list, and when we can, there may not, I don't know how much time we'll have, but at least when Commissioner Snyder's in, we can have a preliminary conversation next week.
Sure.
The lack of coming to sort of a settlement on that, do you have any concerns that it will interfere with any of the contemplated outdoor recreation projects you'd like to support?
I don't. I think that there, there may be instances where it becomes an issue, but at least out of the gate, I don't see that as a major challenge to the types of projects that are envisioned here.
Okay. You also mentioned housing, and as I understand it, one of the other aspects of the picking up the pace on housing work is relates to Act 250 and permitting. Is I thought I saw in the wave of paper going by that the sort of accelerated housing program contemplates waiving Act 250, and I don't know if it's designated downtowns and other designated areas. So is the administration bringing forward a proposal that it hopes to see pass this year for that?
Yes. So my understanding is, and the Agency of Commerce is the lead on this, but my understanding is that that's similar to statutory language that the General Assembly enacted in response to the ARA funds back in 2008, 2009. The ACCD on behalf of the governor will be seeking a similar set of a set of exemptions and also sort of commitments to decision timelines in order to ensure that these projects can move forward or know that they are unable to move forward in enough time that money could be reprogrammed.
Okay. Senator Westman?
It helps to unmute. So the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail, if we might be a little parochial, that will finish the trail.
So there is money between the capital bill and VTrans federal appropriations that will be used to finish the rail trail. This is really looking at amenities, the ability to have wayfinding signs and parking areas and potentially bike racks in adjoining communities should bikers choose to get off the trail and visit a downtown or village center. So it to my mind, it's sort of the next level of build out beyond the physical construction of the trail.
Okay, so the pieces of the money, there's money in the capital bill to finish. There's language for the upkeep of the trail in the T-bill. And then there is, and this money would be found in the one-time ARPA funds or? Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Sounds like the Lamoille County Rail Trail is.
It's not Lamoille County, it's across the whole northern part of the state.
Oh, that's right.
Senator.
Yeah, sorry. It
quite
was the Lamoille
frankly,
Railroad.
And quite frankly, only very little of this will show up in Lamoille County because our stretch from Jeffersonville to Morrisville is done.
I'm casting no aspersions. I'm happy for the entire state of Vermont.
I'm just telling you, if you want to take a really nice bike ride this summer, you can ride from Jeffersonville to Morrisville and back, and you will enjoy Lamoille County at its finest.
All right. Well, in the post-pandemic era, I'll meet you on the trail. Bring your bike. I'll get a bike. We'll go for a ride. Senator McCormick.
Thank you. Very briefly, Mr. Chairman. I live in Windsor County, and my wife and I love that bike trail.
Thank you.
So we have just a few minutes left. Let me see. There was one other. Oh, I wanted to just check out since Senator Westman used the word parochial, so I'll definitely talk about a parochial interest here, and that is, he was telling this story about growing up alongside the Lamoille River, and that it was not a place you would go swimming, and you might be warned off against eating fish from it, and because there was it was still the era of straight pipe discharge. And so we don't have the same situation on Otter Creek, but he talked about the transformation of that water asset to being such a pleasant place now that there are hundreds of people on any given summer afternoon canoeing it, and the whole businesses have built up along the river as a great natural resource. And I was lamenting that I don't see the same, although we have a lot of people in the Champlain Valley, I don't see the Otter Creek getting the same sort of use. And so we do happen to have, there's a string of CSO related towns along Otter Creek. And so if I were to float out a 20-year vision, I would love to, and actually seriously follow up with you. We don't have time now, but how would the towns along Otter Creek, Brandon, Middlebury, Virgin, et cetera, what steps could they take so that they could enjoy the same sort of vibrant waterfront scene that folks along the Lamoille River now enjoy? You know?
That is actually something, and I can see Commissioner Porter is here too, but it's something Lewis and I have discussed, and I think at least some very early steps in that are contemplated in the some of even those outdoor recreation assets. We've recognized that paddler access to the Otter Creek is not as robust as to some of our other water bodies, and how to improve that. And looking at a paddler trail along Otter Creek, I know is something the Fish and Wildlife Department has been discussing. I don't know, Lewis, if you want to give 30 seconds of more detail there.
Sure. Lewis Porter, Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife. Chair Bray, we have great access in this state to lakes and ponds. Our access to rivers and streams is not as great, and I would like to move in that direction, beginning with Otter Creek. And so that would mean paddling craft access and fishing access and amenities along to encourage that kind of use. And you're exactly right. It's a tremendous asset for the state, and one that is not utilized to the extent it could be and should be. So we're happy to talk more about that later on.
I have to tell you, between Johnson and Cambridge Village, you couldn't have many more. in any July, August, September, early October day, they put as many as 300 canoers in the river, and it's very heavily used.
Sometimes to the concern of my angling constituents, but it's
Yes.
a great asset, and one we'd like to see Otter Creek follow suit.
Right. Well, great. Well, sometimes we think on long horizon. I mean, actually, this happens quite a bit in this committee. We're doing shorter term work, but we also are contemplating long-term horizons for change on big assets that need a lot of work. And this just seems like one of those things that would be great to have as a vision for the Otter Creek one end to the other. So, all right. Well, with that, it is 10 on the dot. Thanks so much for walking us through. We asked a lot of questions. Is there anything you didn't get to that you wanted to share with us before we wrap up?
No, I very much was just wanted to have exactly this kind of dialogue and conversation. Appreciate your questions and your input. And we will work to gather the very information you're talking about in advance of Commissioner Walk and Commissioner Snyder being in next week. So thank you for the opportunity, and happy to come back anytime.
Okay, great. Thank you again.
Be well.
You too. With that, we are change of topic, a change of bill. We're returning to S-129. And so one of the things that we've had some conversation so far, I'm blanking it for a moment, if we've actually done a formal bill walkthrough with Mr. O'Grady or not. I know we've discussed aspects of the bill. Mr. O'Grady, can you bail me out on this one?
For S-129?
Yes.
No, you have not done a formal walkthrough of the bill.
Okay, that's what I thought, and that was why we had you up batting first in the batting order. So if we could do that walkthrough, we've had some conversation so far, but we hadn't actually done the formal bill walkthrough. So it'd be good for everyone to get grounded in the bill itself. And if you could share screens and do a bill walkthrough, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay.
Point of order, Mr.
Yeah.
Someone has a bird song in the background. It's kind of distracting. If they could mute, that would be good.
Might be me. There's a cardinal settled outside my window.
That's why it's so distracting. It's a fascinating call.
All right, I am going to try to share screen.
It's actually a Sarah McCormick. It's a Senate Natural Resources Energy soundtrack I play so that people know they're in the right
Natural
committee.
resources, setting the mood. Yeah.
So can everyone see the screen? Hello?
Yes, sir.
I see it.
Muted.
I see the screen.
Okay. So you are in Title 10, Part 4, that area that relates to the governance and all the statutes relating to the regulation of fish and wildlife. The first section amends the creation of the department and its authorities. The first change is to clarify that the authority for the management of fish and wildlife is the responsibility, jurisdiction of the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the commissioner. And in addition to the duties that are granted under Title III, the executive title, the commissioner shall have the authority to implement the policies and purposes specified in Section 4081 of Title 10, and that is the policy and purpose for the management of fish and wildlife. Then there is an amendment to the composition of the Fish and Wildlife Board. Currently, the board is composed of 14 members, each representing a county of the state. This would make the board 12 members, and they would no longer be appointed all by the governor, and they would no longer be representational of each county. Instead, 4 members would be appointed by the commissioner of Fish and Wildlife, 4 by the Speaker of the House, and 4 by the Committee on Committees. You will see that the requirement that they represent each county in the state is struck. And in order to, they will all apply to be appointed. And when considering appointments, the appointing authority, the governor, the speaker, and the Committee on Committees shall give due consideration to the need for geographic diversity and the need to have members who have a history of involvement with and dedication to fish, wildlife, conservation, and natural resources. Upon appointment, each member will get training from the department on coexistence with wildlife, the reduction of conflict between humans and wildlife, and the impacts of climate change on fish and wildlife. And then you get to kind of the kind of meat of the bill. Upon filing a proposed rule with the Secretary of State, the department submits the proposed rule to the board. So the department is assuming or would be given all authority that the Fish and Wildlife Board currently has for rulemaking. And so when the department would issue a rule, they would have to submit it to the Fish and Wildlife Board. So the Fish and Wildlife Board would no longer be regulatory, it would be advisory. And so after a public hearing, the board shall consider whether a proposed rule is designed to maintain the best health, population, utilization levels of the regulated species and other species that are ecologically related to the regulated species. And if the board, by a majority, determines that a proposed rule should be revised, it shall give the department a written report setting forth its recommended revisions and reasons thereto within 60 days of receipt of the proposed rule. And the board shall include with that any public comments it received. The department is not bound by the board's recommendations. It can go forward in conflict with the recommendations of the board. But if it does, the board's report is going to be included with the material submitted to ALCAR. This is in part the conversation Senator McDonald and I had previously. 4042 is really kind of a technical amendment. The commissioner currently is appointed as the executive secretary of the board. Really, the only thing that truly needs to be changed in 4042 is striking out that second sentence, because the commissioner is already appointed pursuant to 3 BSA 2851. Getting rid of the entire section is a little, you don't really need to do that, but it's already, he or she is already appointed under 2851. Section 2 is the amendment to the policy for the regulation of fish and wildlife in the state. You will see there's already the public trust provision in 4081A1, but then in 4081A2, that the commissioner shall manage and regulate the fish and wildlife in accordance with the requirements of this part. And it should probably say the rules adopted under this part. But it's no longer going to be the rules adopted by the Fish and Wildlife Board, because the department, the commissioner, will have the rulemaking authority. And you will see that the Fish and Wildlife Board's authority to carry out and the purposes of the subchapter are struck. And then you will see multiple changes where the board is replaced by the department. The department will have the rulemaking authority that the board currently has. And specifically in 10 BSA 4082 under section 3, the department may adopt rules to be known as the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Regulations. I want to stop there because there is a very peculiar aspect of regulatory law with regard to the Fish and Wildlife Regulations. In 1961, the General Assembly put them in statute and said that they could be amended by the Fish and Wildlife Board or by the General Assembly. So you have just as much regulatory authority over the Fish and Wildlife rules as the Fish and Wildlife Board does. So even though you delegated that authority to the Fish and Wildlife Board, you still maintain some authority over those rules.
Can we pause there just for a moment? Because statute trumps rule, how is this different than that normal relationship where the legislature saw a rule it didn't like, it could just pass statute to override?
Well, you do it pretty much every biennium by directly amending the Fish and Wildlife Board rules.
Okay.
And then again, this is conforming changes, changing board to department, and that's really the rest of the bill. Key change is in section 5 in title 3 under the Agency of Natural Resources Authority. So in the governor's authority to appoint people for the management of natural resources, there's a provision that says any boards that are created are advisory except for the Fish and Wildlife Board and the Natural Resources Board, they have regulatory or quasi judicial functions. And basically what this change would do would strike the Fish and Wildlife Board's regulatory authority. And they would be advisory like all other boards and commissions for the department. Then section 6 is statutory revision authority. It gives legislative council and its statutory revision in the summer the authority to change board to department in those specific sections listed on page 11, lines 1 and 2, and other similar necessary changes similar to that. And then there's a transition provision. The regulations promulgated by the Fish and Wildlife Board and in effect as of the effective date of the act remain in effect and have a full force and effective law until such time as they are repealed or amended by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. That should probably say repealed or amended by the Department of Fish and Wildlife or the General Assembly. And then the terms of the Fish and Wildlife Board as of the effective date of the act terminate 90 days after the effective date of the act. So that basically gives the appointing authorities for the new advisory board 90 days to make appointments. As I previously said, appointments take much longer than people think they do. It's actually hard to make appointments. 90 days is probably a pretty good range, but it doesn't always get done in 90 days. It's actually hard to get people to participate.
Okay.
Do you have any questions?
So, sure. Do you have you have seen the formulation of many boards, probably help facilitate that. Do you have a recommendation what you would replace 90 with in order to be more realistic?
I would say by January 1, 2022. Because this could go in effect if it was passed this year and signed, it would be signed before probably July. And then they'd have 90 days. So I would say January 1, 2022, that doubles the time period.
Okay. So can you, we're not in the committee room together to do this the regular way. Can you flag both that possible edit as well as the one you noted on the line above,
Sure.
repealed or amended by department or legislature?
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Okay, any committee questions for Mr. O'Grady? So I'm just thinking back to you had pointed out that it's unusual that rather than, I think I hadn't really fully appreciated how unusual it was. So we often have a miscellaneous bill that the department brings over that amends penalties or dates or parts of the rule, and then we pass those through. So that's what you're referring to, that we amend rule rather than write new statute on it. Is that correct? The typical.
Correct.
Yeah.
I can send you the rule. I have a screen. Well, no, I have a scan of it. If the bill, that 1961 bill, if you would want it.
Sure. For people interested in the legislative history, it would be good to see. Thanks very much. Okay. With seeing no questions for Mr. O'Grady, then I'd like to. Well, yeah, Senator McDonald.
I may have missed that last one. Senator O'Grady, excuse me, Mr. O'Grady was giving us the changes that would recommend were we to pursue the policy changes set forth in the House bill here. So, the comment has been made that this is not what we usually get. We're not dealing with small changes having to do with species and this, that, and the next thing. This is a more I don't want to say sweeping overhaul, but this is going to change the relationship between the citizens, the board, and the department, and reportedly to reflect the changes in our changing demographics, our changing land uses, etc. So we could hold a public hearing and present to them the latest draft, or is that the plan that we have ahead of us?
I hadn't contemplated a public hearing yet, but I think actually right now we were just, getting a good introduction to the bill. I've also reached out to the Rules Committee to see if, we're past crossover, if there'd be the opportunity to move a bill forward this year. So I haven't yet got an answer on that one. So I don't know, the scope of what we'll try to take on. I think Senator Campion made the point the other day that he wasn't sure how valuable it would be to dig in halfway to this, and perhaps go on to have a public hearing, only to adjourn, go home for roughly 7 months, and then have to commence and probably almost redo most all of the work that we would do in the next 3 weeks. So we're just trying to make sure that if I need to hear back from Rules. Also would like to hear from the committee about its interest in being able to at least move this and send it to the House this year. So, Senator Westman.
I'm doing that. I'm switched computers and I can't figure out how to do the raise my hand function on here. So, so I'm unclear, and I might be the only one here, of what really the authority, the scope of what the Fish and Wildlife Board does now, because as I understand it, when they do biological work and they feed into the Act 250 process or all of those pieces, the Fish and Wildlife Board doesn't have any say over that. So I'm a little unclear myself on what exactly is, what do they do? And what's the scope of
that's a great question. I think that there's often confusion about the scope of what the Fish and Wildlife Board does, but I think you can see really in 10 VSA 4082 what their true authority is. They adopt rules for the regulation of fish and wild game and the taking of fish and wildlife. That is really their authority. And the department implements those rules, but the department has more authority than just implementation of the rules for taking in fish and wildlife. They have, as you referenced, that role in Act 250 or 248 proceedings.
Yep.
They have a role in Endangered Species Act regulation. They have roles in management of fish and wildlife lands. So their role is much broader than the role of the Fish and Wildlife Board, Fish and Game Board.
It would be helpful to me if this doesn't have to be yours, Mr. O'Grady, but for somebody from the department, if I had a list of, here's the things that the department does, here's the things that the board weighs in on from a practical sense, so I could get a chance to see what we're talking about exactly. From reading this, it looks like the Fish and Wildlife Board, if it is just the taking of animals, but I'm not sure of that, so it would be helpful for me from a practical sense to be able to have, here's the list of things that the department does, here's what the board weighs in on.
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Senator McDonald.
To follow up on Senator Westman, I think I share his concern, and which of the two groups, the board or the department, one of them is more ministerial than the other. They carry out what has been called for. And the other of those two bodies is where the germination of the ideas or the suggestions or the initiative to have things carried out takes place. Is that correct? Under the current statute? And my next question is going to be ask you which one does which of those two jobs. But could you explain that?
I think that the board has regulatory authority for the taking of fish and game. That means they are the ones that issue the rules, the law for the taking of fish and game. They largely act on the recommendations of the department, but they do have the ability to initiate rules on their own. So when you say that the board initiates, well, the department is often the one that initiates a proposed rule. And that's because statute says the board is supposed to respond to scientific evidence provided by the department.
So they make the department, whose job it is to study and provide and acquire scientific knowledge, makes suggestions to the board to do things.
Right, and the board is the one that has the authority to make the rules, to propose the rules that would regulate the taking of fish and game. Now, then
so who's representing the citizenry here?
Wait, well, that's a great question, and the whole structure of the board and its scheme is not unusual across the country, because the wildlife of the state are public trust resources, the ferae naturae, as they are referred to under common law. And after the Pete the Moose, I'll just say debacle, you clarified statute that the wildlife are public trust resources, and the commissioner of Fish and Wildlife is the one that holds those fish and wildlife in trust for the public. But many states, as Vermont has done, has set up citizen boards to be either regulatory or advisory in nature, to have that citizen input over the management of fish and wildlife, because they are public trust resources. So this citizen board with authority, regulatory authority, it's not unusual, because the concept is the citizens should have input into the regulation of fish and game. So that's largely the concept of how citizens are involved. But then the Fish and Wildlife Board, they are a public body. So they are subject to the open meeting law and Public Records Act, and citizens have access to them through those means.
I interrupted Senator Westman, and I want to go have him go back in again, but I have yet another follow-up question.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Is that okay?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I'm yielding to Senator Westman, but I'd like to get back in on this. So.
No, you're doing fine. You're hitting all the areas that I started off into. I'm just trying to understand here. I'm trying to relate it to. I'm very aware that a significant portion of the revenues for the department come from fishing and hunting licenses, and how much of that is related to what this board has the authority to do and works around, versus they get a general fund appropriation that deal, and I hear a lot of the biologist stuff that deals. So I'm just trying to understand all of it and their authority and how it all fits together to know what we're talking about. And you're asking all of the questions that would lead into that, Senator.
Thank you. And
So
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
based on what we've been told, from we understand to be the case that the department's job is to do the science, make recommendations, and tell us about which species are growing or shrinking or etc. But the group, the one that represents the public on what should be done with that information and what course should be charted, appears to be the Fish and Wildlife Board. And the question that we continue to hear is that while the Fish and Wildlife Board represented the vast majority of Vermonters' interests back when the majority of Vermonters were hunted in a state that was less developed and was younger, that board seemed to match up with the citizenry and representing them. And we hear many citizens saying, gee, we don't feel represented in that board. And so that representation doesn't match the people that it represents as well as it used to match. And there's a call for an adjustment there. That's what it seems to me and that's not pleasant. And that's not, there are people who are eager, feel that this ought to be coming along. Time is overdue. And there are others that are saying, hey, wait a minute. These are important traditions and you're trampling on our territory. So we sort of need to acknowledge that and hear from folks before we, as we act. So that's
Yes.
Can I just follow up? A
Please.
piece of that is, are the decisions that this board makes, are they those type things that are general in nature, or are if the decisions they're making are just about what the hunters are doing and the taking of that, I just need to understand what the scope of the board is in relation to the decisions that they're making to follow up on what Senator McDonald just talked about. Is the scope of their decisions as broad and how does that all fit?
That's also a great question. And if you read statute, they have specific authority for the taking of fish and game, which is, as you referenced, what hunters and fishers would do and how they do it. But there's also a provision that can be read that they have the authority for the management of fish and wildlife. But I would opine that the department really has the larger authority over the full management of fish and wildlife in the state, as evidenced by the fact that they're involved in the Endangered Species Act and Act 250 and 248 and et cetera. And the board is not involved in those requirements of that law. But the Fish and Wildlife Board rules are supposed to be, as required by statute, supported by science, provided by the department. So they are supposed to be about generally the management of fish and wildlife and the taking of them based on science. So it's not as bright line as you may like. There is a little bleeding over, but generally the Fish and Wildlife Board regulates the taking of fish and wildlife, fish and game. And they do that based on the department's scientific recommendations.
Can I just make
So,
a comment? Well,
yeah, sure.
comment?
Please go ahead.
Yeah,
And then
my
we'll go to
comment
Senator
would be-
McCormick.
Thank you for that. I'm not trying to, I'm just trying to figure out where those lines are. I don't understand those lines, so I'm just trying to.
Right. Well, before we go to Senator McCormick, who's been waiting very patiently, I don't want to lose this thread. Can who amongst people present can help create that 1 or 2 page summary that addresses things like the authority for department versus board, revenues, general fund versus licenses, because that's been brought up, and that the notice, and then there's a little data on how representative the board is, like percentage of people with licenses versus Vermonters at large was something we heard about yesterday. So I guess I would look to council to see if you can work with Mr. Commissioner Porter on pulling that data together, or maybe Mr. Porter already has it.
May I make a
Commissioner Porter,
friendly
please go ahead.
suggestion? Thank you, Lewis Porter, Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife. If I may make a friendly suggestion, I think that my testimony and Mark Scott and Catherine Gessing's on your schedule will clear up a lot of these questions. And of course, we're happy to provide anything in writing to you as well, or any other information. But I think if we had 20 or 25 minutes to present to you, I think we could clear up a lot of these questions and clarify it, at least from our perspective. Thank you.
Okay, so Senator McDonald and Senator McCormick, and then we'll switch gears here.
Mr. Chair, our task as legislators is to tax and to spend and to regulate. That's it. It seems that the money issues are pretty easy. We know who pays them and who doesn't, or where, whatever. But we're getting more testimony that the regulatory part of this is a bit fuzzy and blurred between the ministerial duties and the representative duties. And that's the part that I think if we resolve, then we know how to move forward. Moving forward is going to be painful, but maybe that's why it's now fuzzy, to avoid having to make some tough decisions here. Thank you.
I apologize if my explanation in somehow referenced that or led to the interpretation that the rulemaking is blurred. I don't, or the authority, I don't think it is blurred. I think the Fish and Wildlife Board has a very clear authority, and the department has a very clear authority. I didn't mean to indicate in any way that the authority is blurred. There is some possibility to interpret the board's authority as broader than the taking of Fish and Wildlife. I don't think that they actually do that. And I just wanted to clarify that and apologize if I led to any.
No need to apologize to me. I think you said it like it is, and it's our job to deal with this and make it so that the people listening know what's what, who's in. Yep. So and then we can decide how it ought to be.
Senator McCormick.
Thank you. I know time is short here. I would ask Commissioner Porter in your presentation, either confirm my understanding or correct me. I see this as being analogous to the relationship between the legislature and the administration, which is to say, this is how I explain it to students. The legislature tells the administration what to do because we have that authority. The administration, however, has the expertise, so they tell the legislature what it is we should tell them. Ultimately, the legislature has the last word, but we ought to be, and we tend to be deferential to the experts. That's my understanding of what's going on between the board and your department as well. And that just, if I don't have that right, please straighten it out. Thanks.
I think that's a roughly accurate analogy with one addition, Senator. That is true in regards to hunting, fishing, and trapping regulations, and nothing else of the very broad spectrum of the department's work.
Okay. Thank you for that.
So Commissioner Porter, we'd like to go to you, and I'd like you to make sure that we have a hard stop with at least 5 minutes remaining. Ms. Flanders been on this Zoom session since the moment we started this morning. I want to make sure that she has the opportunity to participate in today's discussion. And for people watching, obviously there's a much bigger discussion to be had. So anyone with an interest in this issue can reach out and connect with the committee. Okay, so Commissioner Porter, floor is yours, and call on your team as you wish.
Thank you. I will. Thank you. And I will try to make it as quick as I can. I would ask that the committee consider having us back, because there's a lot to this, as you and your members note. And I had a long, and I can assure you, brilliantly eloquent introduction about the history of the board and the department and Vermont's successes in wildlife management, but I will skip over that and instead go right to the meat of the question, which is that the current Fish and Wildlife Board, as it's currently structured, takes recommendations and advice on regulations from the Fish and Wildlife Department based on activities authorized by the legislature in statute related to hunting, fishing, and trapping regulations. I'll just read briefly the 10 VSA 4082. The board shall adopt rules under et cetera, known as the Fish and Wildlife Regulations for the regulation of fish and wild game and the taking thereof, except as otherwise specifically provided by law. The rules shall be designed to maintain the best health, population, and utilized levels of the regulated species and of other necessary or desirable species that are ecologically related to the regulated species. In practice, what that means is that we in the department bring the scientific, legal, and law enforcement expertise to make recommendations to the board on hunting, fishing, and trapping regulations, such as means of take, season length, bag limits, and so on. Those regulations are then go to the Administrative Committee on Rules, and then to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. And those are based on activities on statutes passed by the legislature. And they are made to both allow the utilization of species and to protect the health and welfare and health and population of those regulated species. So that's how it breaks down. And I will just pause there briefly and ask if there are questions on that piece.
I don't see any.
Okay, terrific. So the board almost always follows the department's recommendations, in particular when there are matters of biology and population health. I can think of an instance or two in which the board has not followed the department's recommendations, but they have been related to what I would consider more social regulations rather than population, biological health, and so on. For instance, we proposed the curtailment or elimination of crappie commercial fishing, not because of concerns over the population, but because of concerns about whether recreational anglers or commercial anglers should be getting that share of fish. And the board opted not to eliminate commercial fishing for crappie. So that's one example, and I would consider that a social regulation. Extremely unusual even in the social context, and unknown that I know of in the biological and population context. This is also an extremely public process where we hold many public hearings, both as a department and as a board on these regulations. Then I'll switch briefly, if I could, to the appointment of the board and who selects it. And there's been a lot of talk about how it's unclear what the process is, or it's somehow an unclear process. I think it's quite clear. You may disagree with it, but I think it's quite clear. The governor appoints the members of the Fish and Wildlife Board. They serve terms. They can only serve one term. Traditionally, given the role of the board on hunting, fishing, trapping regulations, governors of both parties have appointed people who participate to some level in those activities. That's not a requirement in Vermont law. There could be those who don't participate in those activities appointed under Vermont law, but that has not been done because of the narrowness, I believe, of the authority of the board versus the department. And it's not true in all states. For instance, in New Hampshire, you have to have a license to be on the board. You have to have held a license in 3 of the last 5 years, I believe, to be on the board. And the board has much greater authority over various aspects of the department. The question of revenue to the department, here's somewhere where I very much agree with Rob Mullen. Who pays should not influence wildlife decisions. They're a public trust. They should be and are managed for a public trust. And I have to say, the board and the department have, in most cases, been extremely successful in managing populations and restoring populations in a way that I think Vermonters would have been very surprised at 100 years ago. It's been more successful than I think we could have hoped and anticipated. But just to clear up issues, it varies year to year depending on funding source, but in rough terms, a little under 1/3 of our budget comes from license sales. About 1/3 comes from federal excise taxes on sporting goods and ammunition. And about 1/4 comes from the general fund. And that general fund portion goes primarily to law enforcement, which is not eligible for federal money use. It goes to fish hatcheries, and it goes to our regulatory work. Oh no, I'm sorry. I apologize there. The general fund does not go to our regulatory work. That is paid for with licensed dollars and federal money. One other thing I want to clear up is there are about 70,000 active hunters in Vermont when you count lifetime and permanent license holders as well. But it is true that the number of hunters in Vermont has declined over the years, as it has in much of the country. That has put us in a difficult position in terms of funding some of the work, some of the mandates that we have, which do not have another funding source, most especially our regulatory work. We spend about $500,000 a year on regulatory work in Act 250, Section 248, and timber harvest reviews. And that's paid for with federal money and license dollars. And as you can imagine, an increasing book of work in there juxtaposed against a declining number of hunters leads to a difficult problem and a problematic situation. One other note I wanted to make is there was some reference to the extension of the otter season and some speculation about why that was done. And I just want to clear that up and say, we extended the otter trapping season for 2 reasons. The population is healthy and abundant across the state and doing quite well. And secondly, because the beaver season trapping season extended longer than the otter trapping season, when otter were caught in beaver sets and beaver traps, they were not able to be used because it was past the end of the otter trapping season. So we extended that trapping season in large part due to the health of the population and due to the ability, making it possible for trappers who catch those animals to use the pelts. All right, I've thrown a lot at you. I think I've tried to answer some of the questions that are outstanding in the committee. And if I could, I would turn it over to Mark Scott to talk briefly about the department's work. Mark is the head of the Wildlife Division, and he is going to speak briefly to the breadth of the Wildlife Division's work that goes beyond hunting, fishing, and trapping regulations. I would also like to turn it over to Catherine Gessing, the department's attorney, for a little bit more clarity and specificity on the division of roles legally between the department and the board. I understand we are in very short time here, so I will turn it over to Mark now, if I could, and happy to take questions, all of us at the end. Also very happy to come back and discuss these things at greater length and in more detail. Thank you. Mark, if I may, Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Scott, and thank you everyone for working in these tight time constraints. We know it is what it is in terms of timing, and we will if we proceed, we will certainly a lot more time to the issues. But thank you for giving us some first feedback. So thanks, Mr. Scott.
Thank you. Mark Scott, Director of Wildlife. Louis or the committee staff person, if you could upload that PowerPoint. I had the privilege of sitting in on your committee testimony yesterday that you heard from witnesses. Some of this same information was shared with some of your members who were on the committee last year, as well as I'm hearing very similar testimony to the House Fish and Wildlife Committee recently. What was dawned on me immediately was our communications needs to be a lot better. And I begged the committee and other representatives in legislature and senators to try to reach out and give us more time to talk with you on what we're trying to accomplish for wildlife conservation in the state of Vermont. I felt yesterday and previously testimony that I've heard is there's a misrepresentation going out on what the Fish and Wildlife Department is accomplishing. The changes that we've made since we were a fishing game department up to 1982. And after Ed Kehoe retired, we switched the name with legislators' blessings that was initiated by the department to Fish and Wildlife Department, which I believe is in 1983. I shared this image with your committee last year, Senator Bray. I thought I would share it again. We've got about 37 full-time staff or so in the Wildlife Division. But I'm going to leave all this information with the committee. I'm going to zip through this presentation. So hopefully look at it, ask me questions. What I want to point out to you is this section over here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, maybe you can't, but when you look at the wildlife on the left-hand side of your screen on the upper corner, that is probably considered where our wildlife game species and fur bears get managed by those staff directly. We basically only have one full-time staff who devotes his whole time to game species. That's Nick Fortin, who oversees the moose and deer project. The other staff work about half-time. They include a fur bear biologist. Some of you know Kim Royer. They include a turkey biologist. They include the bear biologist. They also wear other hats in land and conservation. The right-hand side of your screen is all the staff that works on all of those species that are non-hunted in the state of Vermont. It's an incredible large amount of staff. I'm going to go into some of the highlights of what they do. This is all new, that right-hand side of that graph, since 1982. What I want to caution you is don't go down the trail of hearing about AFWA studies or national studies done on credibility and relevancy of agencies. Your Fish and Wildlife Department, and I say it's yours, we work for you, is way ahead of all the other states in changing, reading new constituents and so forth. We started a lot of work of that back in 2005 with the State Wildlife Action Plan. Look at the species on the picture there. You see a brook trout. You'll see a plant species, bobcat. Bobcat and brook trout, those are very common species in today. These are all species of greatest conservation need. That does not mean that these species are rare, threatened, or endangered. They're serious threats they all face, primarily from habitat, changing climates, disease, invasives, so forth. Next slide, please. So this plan's it's updated every 10 years. It's our blueprint with the Fish and Wildlife Service to get us funding through state wildlife grants. But what I think is really important, what I don't think a lot of people realize, is the engagement that the department does with citizens and citizen representation into our wildlife conservation efforts. I think you're hearing from a couple organizations that say it's not there. I beg to differ. In 2005, 72 people representing 60 plus conservation partner organizations served on development teams to create our wildlife action plan. Some of the 2015, 64 people representing 48 conservation partners served on development teams. We received 120 public comments. The difference between the plans was just an upgrade. We included things like climate change and disease into the new plan. Next slide. This is just a long list of all what I would consider our conservation partners in the state of Vermont who have helped us develop our wildlife conservation programs as you see them today in the state of Vermont. I would say, I'd argue it's a minor interest with sportsmen, but a huge interest in other people who care about all wildlife, ranging from Biodiversity interest, I heard that that's a new way we've been doing biodiversity since the 1980s. Next slide. The other part is folks I think it's important for us to do a pulse. How are we doing in the state of Vermont? How are we being relevant? Are we credible with the actions we're doing? So we've been doing scientifically based studies of Vermont residents. Here's some of the survey one we did in 2015. We sampled over 1,000 people, not just from hunters and anglers, but the same number from the general population. We tried to target the survey so it mirrored the state's demographics. Next slide. A couple of highlights from that. I think that are very significant. Overall, this is done in 2015. Are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department as a government agency in Vermont? Or do you not know? 76% of the people responded somewhat or very satisfied. Only 3% remarked in as somewhat dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. Next slide. Do you agree or disagree that the department effectively balanced the interest of anglers, hunters, conservation groups, and the general public? Again, 76% of the residents agreed the department balances interest of users in the public. That's even up from 67%. And I think you see the progression the department has made to be relevant and credible was probably a reason why we're seeing more support from the general public and what the department does for wildlife management programs. Next slide. Communications studies that's been done in the department. And I'll have to say from what I heard yesterday, we still have a ways to go with that. We can get the next slide. We've done 2 different surveys separated by 5 years apart. Percent of respondents who indicated that each of the following sources would be a very credible source of information on fish and wildlife in outdoor recreation. At the top of the list, biologists from the Fish and Wildlife Department, a Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department game warden, 75 to 80% of the people. At the bottom of that list, a sporting goods store, a spokesman from a local sporting organization, or a spokesperson from an environmental organization. That tells me the department is effective on getting the word out. People want to hear from the department on wildlife conservation. Next slide. Do you think a biologist with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife is very credible, somewhat credible, or not at all credible? Again, you can see the improvement done from just 2003 to 2013, the last 20 years. Very credible went from 69% up to 80%. Not at all credible went up from 1% to 3%. So a huge impact. To me, I think that's important and telling. Next slide. How people describe the Fish and Wildlife Department. A large percentage, almost 3/4, said we care about wildlife. We believe it's science-based in what we do. 53% say that out of touch described the department not very well at all, and 17% said somewhat well, but the important part is only 7% said very well. 7% said we're not out of touch. I would argue we are in touch with what people. We can't have successful wildlife management in this state for all species that we manage, including the cardinal that we heard this morning, which is one of 265 breeding birds that the department is responsible for in the state of Vermont. Needs to have everybody pulling together. Next slide. The bottom part of that organizational chart, if you look at that, is our lands and habitat program. You'll see a lot of those people in your committee. The Vermont Conservation Design's on the top of your list. But we started this work back in 1991 after the department changed its focus from just fishing game to all wildlife. Our black bear efforts reached out to create these black bear range habitat mats that every town in the state of Vermont were sent and used a lot. Next slide, thanks. We've created some documents for towns. The bottom one is the first one, Conserving Vermont's Natural Heritage, that we share with all towns in the state of Vermont. The second one is Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage, which is really a progression to try to help the towns implement their own land conservation and planning. Next slide. protecting habitat. I think I'll just let you take a second look at this. I think you're going to have more testimony from other people on what we do. But when you start talking about deer wintering habitat, bear, wetlands, rare, threatened, endangered species habitat, the department has a large number of staff devoted to this effort to do that.
Mark, I'm going to stop you in deference to the committee's time. I know we're already going over. I would just leave the committee with one thought, which is I would recommend that you have members of the Fish and Wildlife Board in to talk to you, since we're talking about their role and their piece of this. And some of them you may already know. Brad Furlan, who used to be the AOA Deputy Secretary, is on the board, as is Nancy Matthews, the Rubenstein School Dean. There are many others as well on a 14-member board. So I'll stop there, Mr. Chair, knowing that we are already going over our time, and thank you. And I would ask that you have us back. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Skessing, I'm sorry we didn't get to you, but we will be inviting you all back. And same thing, I mean, for Commissioner, for you and your team. I appreciate that you did the hurry up, the 2-minute drill for getting through things, and we will have a full 60-minute game downstream here. So, okay, with that, I'd like to make sure that Ms. Flanders, I was wanting to make sure you had at least 5 minutes to talk with the committee, as you're not a regular visitor with us. So always wanted to make sure that you had a chance to talk to us. If you could, the floor is yours. What would you like to let the committee know about S129?
All right. I am a Vermonter. I wasn't born here, but more than 40 years ago, I met a young man when I was at MIT Lincoln Lab. He was an aerospace engineer, and eventually, well, we got married. We had a daughter. This is a picture of our daughter. Can you see her? She's holding a fish. Do you see that fish?
Yes, we can.
That was her first catch, and she was 6 years old. I'd like to have you listen to a letter, and I only have a few minutes. So I asked her to put in her input to this meeting, and I'll read her letter her little note that she wrote an email on. And excuse the chickens in the background. When I was a child, this is Elise's, when I was a child, I used to come and visit my dad and grandparents in Vermont. My dad was an aerospace engineer, but he was also a native Vermonter who loved to hunt, fish, and hike. It's hard to convey the knowledge, love, and appreciation that he passed to me. The magic of watching wild baby turkeys fly into the trees, identification of native butterflies and their host plants, identification of trees, and important information about how they all work together in the ecosystem. Here's a picture of my boy. Can you see him holding his fishing pole? Okay. The beauty of being on a lake with loons and ospreys. My grandparents' whole property was maintained as a habitat, not just for hunting, but to work with nature. My dad is not alone. The majority of hunters in Vermont love their beautiful state. They want to see it conserved for generations. They know they are stewards. They practice leave no trace. I want to show you some more pictures as I'm still reading her letter. Come on, Grandpa, I'm not done yet. Okay. They practice leave no trace. Do you see the picture of the kids? Those are this Vermont's future, people. This is Vermont's future. And we're people of color, hello, but we're a lot of colors. Some of them are very pale. Some of them are not so pale. So here I'm going to continue reading her letter. I want you to keep all of these things in mind. This is our Vermont. This is our land, okay? And this is what she continues to say. A majority of hunters in Vermont love their state. They want to see it conserved for generations. They know they're stewards. They practice leave no trace. The Department of Fish and Wildlife is an important part of this picture. The people who choose to be a part of it have to understand nature and people. I don't think Learning from a book, a course, or being on a committee comes close to the boots on the ground understanding of both the ecology and facilitation of people's experience with nature. A box ticker, and I'm still reading from her little note, a box ticker behind the desk won't understand a box ticker behind the desk won't understand that certain popular approaches, can you see our little grandson? Popular approaches can do more harm than good. Where I live, for example, deer are overgrazing the native plants and leave behind invasive species because people oppose hunting. This makes it hard for me to grow flowers that support the native butterflies, pollinators, and birds that I'm trying to attract. Vermont is special and Vermonters are special. Please do not break up this beautiful service just to tick off a box. And I just want you to know, look, I am a Vermonter. You're Vermonters. This is our future. And that's all I have to say. It started out with a young girl who learned how to fish. Her great-grandfather was Senator Ralph Flanders of Vermont, who stood alone and on the floor of the US Senate against McCarthy. But she's now a mom, and I'm now a grandmother. And thank you so much for giving me time to speak. That's all.
All right. Thank you very much
Thank you.
for joining us. And it's always, we deal with a lot of information that's in black and white, as they say, between the four corners of a page, legal documents, etc. But we know that behind all this is all the people and all the habitat, all the wildlife. And so it's good to have someone in, reminding us of the human side of all the work we're doing. So
I've got a question. Senator Bray, I see that I hit the mute button. Did you hear everything that I had to say?
yes.
All right.
Yes.
This is our Vermont.
Yep.
Just keep that in mind as you make whatever decisions are required. And thanks for your time.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. Any committee comments or questions before we change topics for our last 20 minutes or so of the morning session? Okay, so thank you, Commissioner and team. Thank you, Ms. Flanders. We're switching topics back to the scuttling of the ship Adirondack. The question came up yesterday. Basically, what is we talked about role of the legislature and influencing this. What's our legal purchase on anything that's going on? In particular, a permit's already been issued by ANR. So Mr. O'Grady's in to talk to us about our role in lake encroachment and our role as it might relate to this particular instance of proposed lake encroachment. So Mr. O'Grady, I don't know if you've prepared some remarks.
I was asked to prepare remarks yesterday for Senate institutions, and FYI, they asked me to draft a memo based on my remarks and to CC you, Senator Bray, with that memo. It will be done probably by noon.
Okay, thanks. I will, and sorry to interrupt. So when I get it, could you CC Jude on that, please? And then sure. Jude, could you please distribute that to the full committee and post it on our website on this topic? Thanks.
So the surface waters of the state are a public trust resource, and as a public trust resource, they need to be managed for the benefit of the people, and the General Assembly is the entity where that management authority rests. But the General Assembly can also delegate that authority to other governmental entities such as state agencies or cities. For example, the General Assembly has delegated the management of the filled lands in the Burlington Harbor to the city of Burlington, subject to their use for the public. You have also delegated the regulation of encroachment on lakes and ponds in the state to the Department of Environmental Conservation. In Title 29, Chapter 11, the General Assembly makes a specific declaration that the lakes and ponds of the state are public trust resources, and that the Department of Environmental Conservation is the entity that shall manage those waters according to the public trust and the criteria that you have specified in 29 VSA Chapter 11. So the sinking of a ship is an encroachment. So an encroachment is defined as the placing or causing to be placed any material or structure in any lakes and ponds that are public waters, or to alter or cause to be altered the lands underlying any waters. So that would include placing a chip on the lands underlying Lake Champlain. As the chair has already referenced, DEC received a permit application for that encroachment in 2020. They recently, I don't know the exact date, but they recently issued that permit. So they are the permit applicant, which I believe is the Division of Historic Preservation, has the authority right now to place that ship, the ferry, on the bottomlands of Lake Champlain to encroach as authorized underneath that permit. What role you have, I think you probably don't have a role in the authority to issue the encroachment permit. It has been issued the right to the law at the time vested with the permit applicant on the date they submitted an administratively complete permit application, and they have now received a permit for the General Assembly to now step in and revoke that permit would probably raise separation of powers concerns. You enact the law, the executive executes the law. They have executed it. You do have an opportunity because the Division of Historic Preservation is the applicant. You can direct how they would implement, most specifically through appropriations. They will need money to implement that permit. And if you don't fund it, they can't implement it. So that is a possible opportunity. I've also heard advocates say that there needs to be a policy for when it's appropriate to have ships, boats scuttled, creation of artificial reefs. I would say you already have that policy. It's in Title 29. It's the criteria for issuance of an encroachment permit. The department has to determine that the activity is in the public good. And there's criteria that the department is supposed to review. So I think you have that. Now, do you have criteria for what's going to be in a historic underground preserve by the Division of Historic Preservation? No, but that's that could be, you can argue that that's a different thing the encroachment. So that's basically where you are. Oh, I would also offer that some people are saying it's a water quality issue. It's my understanding that DEC takes the position that a boat that doesn't have an ongoing discharge, so there are no liquids or fuels or other chemicals that are being entered into a lake or a pond, is not an ongoing discharge, and therefore is not requiring a water quality discharge permit or in violation of a water quality discharge law. So if the ferry is stripped of all fluids and other things that could discharge into the lake, then it likely is not an ongoing discharge and would not need a discharge permit. And that's fairly consistent with US EPA's guidance on the creation of artificial reefs. There is a Rivers and Harbors Act provision that says if you are going to create an artificial reef, including through sinking of a ship, that you need a US Army Corps of Engineers permit. It's my understanding that this activity already has that permit. So it's been determined not to be a barrier to navigation. So that's what I know about this, and I've only been involved in this since Wednesday afternoon.
Okay. Well, happily for us, your quick study. So the no ongoing discharge, there must be, I suppose it's physically impossible to totally clean a vessel that's 100 years old of all residues or paints or lead or, so is there a standard published that says, okay, something is quote unquote clean enough to constitute not being the source of an ongoing discharge, acknowledging probably, I'm guessing, the scientific reality that yes, things are going to come out of that ship, but they don't rise to the level of being an quote unquote ongoing discharge. Do you know if there's criteria that you accept that something's clean enough to say, okay, there's no ongoing discharge?
I am unaware of that. You may want to talk to the agency. I mean, there are abandoned vessels that recur in the state. The last time was maybe the last big issue about it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. There was an abandoned sailboat. I think it was in Mallets Bay, and the agency said there's no liquid on it. There's no fluid on it. You know, it's not right. Discharging. It's not within our regulation. That led to a whole law about abandoned vessels. But it's not a water quality issue.
Yeah. Did transportation get involved? Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, transportation was involved.
Because it's a registered vehicle of sorts?
It was
Vessel.
sitting on the ice in front, right in the middle of Mallets Bay.
Okay. All right. So I know we thank you very much. That's very helpful. Did any member of the committee have additional questions about this issue and what our role is at this point in time? Senator Campion.
So we can't, I mean, we could pass something. It's not, I suspect, going to be retroactive if we wanted to, but we could pass something that would give guidelines going forward. That's one recommendation, correct? That's one thing that's a possibility. We could, just to get we could do nothing. We could draft something that would, with a committee vote, that would either give our support or our concern and forward that to the administration as well as the city of Burlington. I'm trying to think of other options that are on the table.
Can I,
Senator Westman.
Mr. O'Grady, did you say that this would require funding to accomplish the
Right.
sinking of this?
My understanding that the Division of Historic Preservation would need some funds in order to complete the project.
So if this committee took a position and said to appropriations, no money for this function, it becomes a stalled project.
Right. You are not. They couldn't fulfill the project unless they got funds from elsewhere.
And what are the funds? How much? Does anybody know?
I don't know off the top of my head. The Division of Historic Preservation was a witness yesterday in Senate institutions. I think they probably said how much it would cost, but I don't recall.
My understanding from being on the institutions committee is that actually the state doesn't pay for the sinking. The state will pay for the maintenance and management. The boat right now is not the state's. At the instant that it hits the bottom of the lake, it becomes the state's. And then the state will have to maintain the diving site and management and so on. I think right now, one of the arguments is that we're not actually paying for it anyway. But I also want to alert this committee that yesterday I made arguments very similar to Senator Campion's. I'm concerned about this. I made the arguments in, Brian, I don't know if you could hear me. You were away from your desk.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. That I made arguments very similar to yours in institutions yesterday and just got the bums rush. The vote in committee was 4-1. And the view is that the legislature should not be intervening in matters that have been decided by people we have already authorized to make those decisions. And Senator Mazza in particular argued very vociferously on that. So I don't know, we're likely to have two committees at odds with one another if this committee decides to take a position. I must admit that I was somewhat without an argument to counter Mazza's argument. I don't like this project and I'd like to impede it, but his argument is that we have set up an agency of natural resources. We've empowered them to make these decisions in our behalf, and they've made them. And at this point, we're behaving inappropriately by intervening after the fact. So that's a report on the institutions committee.
Okay. Well, thank you for that update. It's good to have a foot in each room.
I had to admit, I mean, I had actually said out loud, I'm somewhat at a loss as to how to counter that. I don't give up easy as a rule, but he made a strong argument, even though I still think he's wrong. I'm trying to rethink why, where the actual legal arguments are.
Well, I think I think it's just on our radar that it may be that this committee believes the lake would be worse off doing it. And we're the Natural Resource and Energy Committee, and things like this come to us, and we have dialogue with the administration, and there are possibilities of legislation moving forward, or as we mentioned, and Senator Westman mentioned, we can work with other committees and perhaps the city of Burlington.
Well, the one weakness I think, and I was going to say Maz's argument, it's the entire institutions committee other than me. Their argument really is that ANR has jurisdiction over this, but ANR has jurisdiction over various aspects of natural resources, in particular, and they keep focusing on the pollution question. And my view is that I don't think we should be using the lake as a junkyard. It's just a matter of, this is a public trust, and is this really what we want to do with our lake, the people's lake that we on which we are the people own it, and we're the people's trustees on it. But do we really want to treat? And I'm not sure if that's where the jurisdiction on that is. Aside from potential pollution, is this a proper use of the lake? Michael, what does the law say about who decides that?
Well, well,
is this a proper use of the lake?
Well, that's what the encroachment, well, for this specific activity, the placing of a ship on the lake bottom, that qualifies as an encroachment, and you've delegated that authority to the Agency of Natural Resource.
Okay.
In Title 29. And I think it's of note that it is in Title 29. Title 29 is not conservation and development. Title 29 is the public property title. So you have put this authority for A&R to approve encroachments in the title on public property, because lakes and ponds are public property.
Yeah. And the lake is, you might wish that the lake were sacrosanct, but it obviously isn't. It's full of recreational vehicles. It's ringed with human development. And to this day, we're discharging human waste into it, and phosphorus and so on. So the idea that, because I had said, why don't we put a roller coaster on the State House lawn? I mean, it'll attract tourists. The idea this will attract divers. But I don't know where we go with it. I don't like the project, but I don't know where we go with it.
Right. One quick question. Mr. Groveman was in, so to Mr. Grady, Mr. Groveman was in, and he was citing statute about public good being defined as, quote unquote, the greatest benefit to the people of Vermont. So, I'm not sure how that phrase gets interpreted, greatest benefit of the people of Vermont. How broad does the benefit have to be? Because the counter to that was, there's a very small number of people who ever dive on this wreck. So it's not to the greatest benefit. And I don't know how you square the number of people who will enjoy something compared to whether or not it satisfies that criterion of greatest benefit. Do you know anything about how to read that?
Well, the public good definition that John Groveman gave is the definition in Title 29, Chapter 11. But then there is a separate section in that chapter that directs how the department is going to investigate and determine what is in the public good. And it provides that in determining whether encroachment will adversely affect the public good, because the chapter says that the permit can't be issued if it's going to adversely affect the public good. So in determining whether it will adversely affect the public good, DEC shall consider the effect of the proposed encroachment as well as the potential cumulative effect of existing encroachments on water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, aquatic and shoreline vegetation, navigation, and other recreational and public uses, including fishing and swimming, consistency with the natural surroundings, and consistency with municipal shoreline ordinances or any applicable state plans. So those are the criteria that they need to review and to determine whether or not it's adversely affecting the public good. If it is not adversely affecting the public good, then the permit can be issued. So I would expect that the department's permit issuance addresses that criteria, and you can look to see how it has determined that it does not adversely affect the public good.
Okay. Before we go to Senator McDonald, can you request, I don't know what we should be requesting precisely, the permit and comment, like LCAR gets a packet that lets us see how something was developed and issued. I mean, it's a rule rather than a permit. Is there something comparable we could examine in this case?
Sure. The permit application is actually online under the environmental notice bulletin.
Okay.
When I looked on Wednesday, I did not see the permit itself, but I can look again and see if the permit itself is there. And I can also request it from Misha Setner as the A&R employee that's been overseeing it. He's
Okay,
at Lakes
thank
and
you.
Ponds.
Great, thanks very much. Senator McDonald, and I think it's last question to you.
I apologize, Mr. Chair. Which department are we talking about approving this?
So it's a little gray because the Department of Environmental Conservation is the one that approves the encroachment permit, but the Division of Historic Preservation has applied for that permit.
Okay. Well, there's a historic preservation or the Commissioner of Parks. Seems like a good idea. How has it been certified or determined to have been, scrubbed out and not contain all sorts of bad stuff?
There's actually a US EPA and US Maritime Administration document that provides guidance on how to create artificial reefs. And apparently the applicants have followed that.
Okay. So thank you for chapters 2 and 3 of the scuttling of the Adirondack. I would just ask people to watch for an email that includes the information like Mr. O'Grady's memo, plus the information we'll get from the department on the permit application. And then when we reconvene, we'll have a discussion about how do we prioritize this? Where do we want to go next on this as a committee? And maybe Senator McCormick, could you investigate the cost related, since I'm guessing they must bring something to institutions as a request? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let me just,
Mr. Chairman, on the cost.
Yes.
The way that what came from the House is that there's an appropriation for the management of underwater wrecks of diving sites. There are something like 60 in the lake, and there are several that are in line to be made into state recognized sites. And that appropriation has with it the corollary that money is not to be used for the Adirondack project.
Okay. If from our presentation yesterday, I guess it was, I believe there's going to be an onshore. It may be that all the money is for the onshore piece that describes what's out there 1.5 miles away and history of the vessel and stuff like that. Okay, well, great. So we're due on the floor. Thank you, everyone. See you on the floor. And if I don't see you, have a